Japan shot dead 2 people and injured 6 in a shooting spree at a gym. After the incident, Japan's Prime Minister said he feared that the country was becoming like others, and newspaper editorials worried that the gun culture was becoming rampant.
The resulting hysteria meant the numbers quickly dropped back down. Take just last year as an example. Only one person was killed by a gun, and that was a mob crime boss. The laws have also been particularly effective in tackling gun use amongst Japan's notorious gang, including the Yakuza, who are the biggest gun owners after the police.
Kenichi Shinoda was charged for the crime of allowing a subordinate gang member to carry a gun. The Supreme Court sentenced him to 6 years imprisonment.
Henrietta, can you give us the global picture on armed violence around the world? Where are the most affected locations?
Well, we have to be clear that gun violence is a constant source of misery, tragedy and anxiety across the world. And I mean, in the US, where the Constitution actually restricts legislative bodies from prohibiting firearm possession, there were 312 mass shootings alone this year. Over 33,000 people killed every year from firearms, which makes the US on a par with the Democratic Republic of the Congo. But in general, firearm-related policies in East Asia tend to be amongst the most restrictive in the world. And Japan is the only country of that region to have signed and ratified the Arms Trade Treaty, which is the first international push towards the standardization of import, export and transfer of conventional arms. Illicit trade of arms, especially small arms, is crucial for decreasing the chances not only of paramilitary or terrorist groups acquiring tools of violence, but also civilians.
But one of the biggest contributors to low gun violence is the unique approach taken by police. While guns might be used by officers tackling armed criminals like the Yakuza, the majority don't carry guns. Here's Japanese journalist Anthony Berto.
Japanese police aren't outfitted in a military way and never use their guns. I think, like last year, only 6 shots were fired from Japanese police nationwide.
So to compensate for the lack of guns, Japanese police rely heavily on their skills in martial arts. And they're said to train more than any other nation. Here's former police officer Tahe Agawa.
Officers attend police training schools for half a year or year. You have to do judo or kendo for over 6 hours every week. Even after qualifying as a police officer, you have to perform practice drill every day. You also have to do a kendo or judo drill for at least 1 hour a week without fail.
To find out how martial arts became vital self-defense tools in policing, we sent our local reporter, Yuzuha Oka, to the Taihojutsu Training Center.
So what is Taihojutsu?
Taihojutsu is a martial arts technique used when there's a resistance from criminals, with the aim of stopping them safely and effectively. The police use it for all our opponents.
Yes, sometimes there are occasions when a criminal can suddenly come towards you. But instead of dealing with them head-on, we try to create a manageable space between us and our opponent.
There are steps that you go through when tackling someone. We went through this in training just now. If you're able to push people in the top of their back with your knee, then you're able to get control over them, even if they're stronger. And we put that into real-world practice.
Journalist Anthony Berto has seen these techniques put into practice across Japan, and particularly on the streets of Tokyo.
Their first instinct is to not reach for their gun. What most Japanese police will do is to get huge futons and essentially roll up the person who is being violent or drunk into a little burrito and carry them back to the station and calm them down. The response to violence is never violence, it's always to de-escalate it.
And that technique is very much appreciated by Japanese society.
We can walk very safely at night in Japan, and it has lots to do with the fact that we have no guns in this country.
Horrific murders in Japan would never involve the use of guns.
Also with us today, we have Ian Overton. Ian's the Executive Director of Action on Armed Violence and also the author of Gun Baby Gun, which gives a detailed analysis of the relationship between us humans and guns. What do you make of the Japanese procedures about even holding a gun in your hands? What makes that so very different to other nations?
Well, Japan has always had, ever since guns first really entered the country, strict gun laws. They are the first nation to actually impose gun laws in the whole world. And I think it laid down a bedrock saying that guns really don't play a part in civilian society. And you compare the strictness of Japanese gun laws to, let's say, American gun laws, where a 14-year-old on his birthday in Montana can go into a gun shop and get a gun. But is Japan absolutely unique in terms of its rigorous procedures? No. Iceland, for instance, has very rigorous procedures, but there are lots of guns there. And yet Iceland has virtually no gun violence.
So, sorry, rigorous procedures, but there are lots of legal guns there or lots of illegal guns?
Lots of legal guns.
Lots of legal guns, OK.
Exactly.
And what I found really striking was the notion that the police are so highly trained, they really don't feel that they need guns in order to apprehend criminals because they've become so good at being able to apprehend them in a different way.
Well, there would be listeners, particularly from America, who would listen to this and think, well, you don't take a knife to a gunfight, and they would think it was ludicrous to have unarmed police. The American model has been militarize the police. So you have 80,000 SWAT team raids every single year in America. But the challenge I have is that there is very little evidence that a more militarized police results in a more peaceful society. And I'm very concerned that if you have too many police pulling out a gun at the first instance of crime, then you lead to a miniature arms race between police and criminals.
So, Ian, is it really true that all sectors of society have that same attitude to guns?
I think what really differentiates, as far as I can see, Japan from, let's say, America, is the general approach towards the individual and the collectives in society. So in America, you've got this long tradition of pastoral farmers. If someone comes along and steals one of their cattle, they have to shoot that person immediately because that is the distance between them surviving the winter and their family dying. Now, that sort of rugged individualism is not seen in Japanese culture. And therefore, I think if the collective decide that guns just don't play a part in society, that even influences criminal gangs' use of whether they should be arming themselves as individuals.
But can you really say that you can always be sure that the individual is going to do right and the background checks work?
No, I mean, the moment you have guns in society, you will have gun violence. But I think it's about the quantity. If there are very few guns in society, you will almost inevitably have very few levels of gun violence.
Can we talk a bit about the cost on civil liberties as well? And Henrietta, the Japanese police routinely search citizens. They pay people home visits in order to make sure that they are obeying the gun laws. Could you see that as being a gross infringement on privacy?
There's clear evidence that you have to try to keep guns out of the hands of high-risk individuals and networks, and that's really important. But the criminal justice system in Japan has been criticised for its very severe kind of nature. I mean, once you're picked up and charged with a crime, the chances of you going to jail are very high, and the conviction rates are, well over 98%. So you could say that there are things that you might want to criticise in relation to the way the criminal justice system works, but that would apply to all forms of legal infringement. It wouldn't just be a question of guns.
You're listening to My Perfect Country on the BBC World Service. Our aim is to build an imaginary country where things really work for you. This week, we're looking at Japan's gun control policy. So now the big question for the studio. Have any of you ever held a gun, fired a gun?
No, I haven't. I was thinking about this as I was contemplating this programme, just how far removed my own life is. I've never seen a gun. I've never, obviously, then held a gun. Any of you?
Yes, absolutely. I've held and fired a gun, but that was
absolutely.
Why?
Of course she has.
Why absolutely?
Being brought up in a rural area, I think. And then, of course, I've worked in parts of the world where there are a lot of guns around and where things are very insecure.
Have you?
I held a gun growing up in the countryside. Didn't like it. Wouldn't do it again.
Ian, have you held lots of guns?
I have. As a teenager, I was the head of a gun club, and also I was a marksman trained up with the British Army. But then, as a life as a journalist, I've been held up at gunpoint 3 times, shot at 3 times.
In the UK?
No, around the world. Last time I was held up was in Amsterdam. I've been to 20 war zones or conflict zones, and I've seen a lot of death and mayhem caused by guns. And I think after a while, picking up a gun seems slightly obscene for pleasure.
Back with Japan now. We've heard about the strict protocols that prevent most citizens obtaining guns and the novel methods used by the police. But as great as those laws sound in theory, in practice, it can be a different story. Here's crime reporter Jake Adelstein.
Cops here are not supposed to fire at a suspect unless they fire a warning shot. And I believe there was a case a few years ago where a criminal drove his car towards the cop and the cop shot it. And then the cop was put on trial for manslaughter. The Japanese hysteria is so great. Once I was watching a shooting practice by the self-defense forces. One bullet shell was unaccounted for. So some shell had fallen behind like one of the targets, and nobody was allowed to leave the facilities until they found the shell.
But into that vacuum created by very sharp gun awareness falls the criminal desire to harm. And here's retired police officer Tae Egawa pointing out that the eradication of guns has given a greater prominence to other weapons.
Ordinary Japanese people don't have access to guns. On the other hand, swords and knives and things like that are used. So that's why we see a trend for knife usage in Japanese crime.
For Anthony Berthaud, the use of guns and knives can't be compared.
The two weapons are fundamentally different things because the only thing you're going to use a gun for is to shoot someone. There's a very high reverence for knives as well. It's kind of like an art, and I don't think there's any movement to ban knives.
And the disassociation of guns with violence has led them to enter a different sphere, where they're potentially just as dangerous. At Tokyo University, we spoke to a student of criminology to hear of his experience with gun control.
When I hear gun control, I think more of hunting. Because I'm from the country, I actually saw guns around my house. There was this time where a hunter was using a shotgun, and like the shells were flying onto our house. There's a lot of talk about how kids should wear vivid colored shirts when they go into the woods. I guess gun control in Japan isn't complete.
Well, despite the high prevalence of guns in the countryside, one thing the laws do rely on is Japanese society's aversion to guns. Here's journalist Anthony Berthaud.
I've never heard of the argument that people want to loosen gun regulations and want to have more guns because people are terrified of guns. A lot of it is stemmed from this post-war sentiment of pacifism, that the war was horrible and we can never have that again. People assume that peace is always going to exist. And when you have a culture like that, you don't really feel the need to arm yourself or to have an object that disrupts that peace.
This was a small but noisy rally against constitutional revision in Tokyo recently.
That ingrained sense of pacifism is under threat from the current Japanese Prime Minister, Shinzo Abe. Our reporter, Yuzuha Oka, discussed this with political science professor Kuchi Nakano.
The Japanese government is now enabling the exercise of collective self-defense, firing weapons if necessary, or taking part in multilateral missions. It is an unknown territory.
What are the cultural implications for that?
Maybe the government will try to normalize occasional death in the self-defense force and perhaps even try to glorify the exercise of weapons.
Well, let's broaden the argument as well. Across the world, our fears about terrorist attacks are heightened, and it's a difficult future to predict for all. And even Japan has seen the trade of illegal weapons in its past. Here's Tae Egawa again.
When guns are used by criminal organizations, they are illegally imported. There have been cases where they are brought over on boats. Alternatively, the criminal pack guns inside of a tuna, so it looks like a frozen tuna. But we have discovered cases where there's actually a gun hidden inside.